Hey everybody, I'm John Davenport. Today I'll be talking about Superfast application prototyping with Phoenix Liveview. And this is just about my story of figuring out how to build an MVP for a web app in 40 hours or less. So this is sort of my story. This is how I got here. The reason I got into software engineering is because I wanted to be able to build and sell my own software applications. So I started teaching myself how to write code in like 2016. And since then, I've gotten really good at failing. In 2016 to 2019, I was teaching myself, I was trying to build Python apps, tried to do like a Kroger integration shopping list. I tried to ship a couple of manufacturing apps, and for a low-level, mid-level developer, shipping Python apps is actually really hard because it's complicated. There are a lot of choices, and it's unlikely you're going to actually make the good choices that are necessary to ship something of moderate complexity as a junior mid-level engineer. Then fast forward to 2019, I found Elixir. Elixir was a milestone for me because the simplicity of the language enabled me to actually build stuff that worked, because there were less choices that you had to make. There was a pretty prescriptive path you had to follow to make stuff work. So I was actually able to build something that worked. I built User Docs. User Docs was an application that could automatically take screenshots of web apps for technical writers. So I managed to actually get it up and running. And then for a couple of years, I failed to get it out the door. I couldn't get it published, couldn't get it in front of people, but eventually I figured that out. I got it out in front of people. I had a live working application, and, I spent a year and a half or so trying to get people to use it and trying to sell it, which I failed to do miserably. I made $0.00 off of User Docs. And I finally gave up on User Docs around June, and I had an idea for SME interviews. SME interviews is an application that helps technical writers conduct SME interviews with experts so that they can write technical documentation. And I had it lined up pretty well in my head, and I was able to build, ship, and get the app in front of people in about 50 to 60 hours. It took me about 2 weeks total to get it up and running. And then I did the same thing. Went out on LinkedIn. I talked to the people who were interested in it. I got them to use the app. Nobody cared. And I stopped working on it. And it took me like 2 months to figure out that SME interviews was a non-starter. Now, I guarantee y'all, if I had been shipping one app every 2 months for the last 3 years, I'd have a hit by now. So, and the other great part is I don't even have to think about SME interviews anymore. I don't ever wonder whether or not SME interviews could be a hit, because I know it's not a hit. So, and then I actually started working on BandwidthHero, partly because I wanted to give this talk. So I started working on BandwidthHero 2 Sundays ago. I'm about 75% done with it. I'll probably ship it this weekend, and we'll be able to get it out in front of potential customers and figure out if it's going to work. So I'm going to start off with some lessons learned that are not necessarily about software engineering, but they're for anybody who is interested in building and selling their own software. And I can summarize it in one sentence. If you want to sell software, the worst thing you can do is write code, because it's easy to sell an idea and figure out if people are interested in it. And it's easy to change that idea if people aren't interested in it. If you have code, it's not easy to change code. It's hard to change it. So until you have some good idea that people are interested enough in what you're doing to pay for it, you should not put your hands on the keyboard. And as you all know, I'm sure it's way easier to start a project than it is to change one. So start a project, but start it at the right time. Don't start it when it's in your head and you don't have an idea of whether people want it or not. And then the last one, this is probably the most discouraging point, is you want to sell software. If you want to sell software, don't write it. Just sell it. Don't worry about whether or not it's there. And as engineers, this is like verboten, because we watch all these sales guys go out and sell stuff that doesn't exist, and then you have to write it, and it drives you nuts. But the fact of the matter is, if you want to sell software, that's what you got to do, because you shouldn't put your hands on the keyboard if you're not getting paid. So less financial commitments, less code. If you have big financial commitments, sure, go build your machine learning pipeline, crap, huge React UI, all that stuff. But if you're not getting paid, then you should write as little code as possible to get your idea into people's hands. So that being said, there is a huge business value in a 40-hour MVP. Let's go back a slide, talk about what the business value actually is. I was on user docs for 3 years, y'all. That is 36 months. I was on SME interviews for 2 months. So the business value of the 40-hour MVP is 34 months. And if I had paid somebody a software engineer's salary to write that for me, that would be like $500,000. That's a lot of money. So if you're going to write a 40-hour MVP, you have to plan it properly. And the short answer here is, the more code you write, the more problems you're going to have. So don't write much. The first trick is you should only approach easy problems. One of the things I do nowadays is I get involved with a lot of salespeople, because I've figured out that writing software won't sell any software. So now I got to learn how to sell, talk to a lot of salespeople. What I tell these salespeople is, if you can get financial commitments for your idea, I will build it for you. And we'll see if it works. Partly because I know I can write that MVP in 40 hours. And you'll get a lot of people, and they'll come back and they'll be like, oh yeah, like this CRM, let's just rewrite this CRM. It's like, nope, you're not someone that I need to be talking to. Because they have to understand you need an easy problem, because you can't write a 40-hour MVP for a hard problem. Start with easy problems. The next part is take out 90% of the vision. Like everything that you or they think needs to go into the MVP, nah, probably not. You really need to think through, what is the problem that you're trying to solve, and what is the bare minimum work that you can do to solve it. And 90% of what you think needs to be in there, or they think needs to be in there, is fluff, and it can go. So you distill it down to the bare minimum that's required to solve the problem. You express it as a model or a set of models, like entity relationship diagram style, and you map that model to a plan that's like one-to-one with PHX LiveGen, right? So you know what your objects are. Maybe you got some many-to-many tables, you got some other objects. Your plan basically needs to be to run PHX LiveGen 8 times or 10 times, and then compose up the UI elements that it generates into an MVP. And you need to take a good look at how long you think each one of those models is going to ship, and only plan in 40 hours of work, and then prioritize it to make sure that the important stuff is in that 40 hours, and everything else needs to go out. So this is my example. This is what we're working on. The BandwidthHero is an application that helps ERP contractors find jobs. And the way it works is, you go to BandwidthHero, you enter the specific ERP modules that you have skills with, how many projects and years you have skills in them, and then what your availability is for the next several years. So you can be like, I'm available for 25 hours for the next 3 months. I'm available for 40 hours the 6 months after that. I'm available for 0 hours in 2023 or whatever. And then on the other hand, you have recruiters who can come in and they can post their project, and then it will match the project requirements to consultants who know how to do that work. So this is how we planned it. You got to have a contractor profile that has their availability and skills. Now, I estimated that at about 25 hours. I think it wound up being 3 or 4 models to build the contractor profile. The recruiter profile, I estimated at about 10 hours. That one is basically similar. There's some information about the recruiter, and then the opportunity, which is the project, and then the matching algorithm. So I'm at opportunities. I'm about 30 hours into this MVP. I've done like 2 full day Sundays and then like 3 or 4, 3-hour weeknights to get this thing ready. And it's like 75% there. Like I will probably ship it this weekend and we will be off to the races, getting it in front of contractors. Oh, and then, right, I put stuff out because even though it looks important, like that's not what we can get out the door in 40 hours. That's what we can get out the door in 40 hours. And when people start paying us, then we can write some more stuff. So here's the philosophy. This is what I follow. First, customize your generator. There's a nice article on Medium about how to do it. It's actually pretty simple. You just copy like 2 EX files up out of the Phoenix directory. You copy the templates out and you put them in the priv directory. You can go in there and you can start customizing stuff. The generators are pretty freaking good. They're 90% of what you need, but there are a few abstractions you can add in there that will make your life easy. For example, when you generate the index page, it like plops a table right there in your markup. Take that table, factor it off into a components file so that you can call the table both from the index file and from other stuff that needs to use it. In the show, it's like a list with ULs or something. Copy that off to a card, put it off in your components directory. That way you can call it. You can compose your app up after you run the generators. Second point, the generated code is the canonical representation of your application. You don't need other crap. You're writing a CRUD app. You need to create stuff, delete stuff, update stuff. You don't change it. And the reason you don't change it is because maybe you want to run the generator again. You're like, this thing is really important to the app. I'm going to put it in my generator and I'm going to run the generator again and keep using the generated code. You just saved yourself a lot of maintenance and modification as you're going through your 40-hour MVP. Don't change the generated code. Third, the generated code is complete. Do not remove parts of it, regardless of whether you use it or not. Because if you run the Phoenix generators, it gives you like this set of routes. And you're like, put that in your router file. And you're like, I don't use these 3 routes. Put them in anyway. Put them in under dev test because you also get a round of tests. And those tests will sit there and test your indexes and test your components and test all of your markup to make sure that it works. And then you don't actually have to write that many tests because it's all already under test. And all you're doing is composing tested components together. So yeah, keep all your routes in there. That way, like you have your front end, you generated front end tests, generated back end tests, run all that stuff under mixed test watch, and do not allow your tests to bloat because you want them to go like once a second. And I've got in SME interviews and BandwidthHero, they're both running like 200 to 300 tests. And all those tests run in less than a second. So that means I can sit there and code on stuff. I know the second that I break something, literally. You need a small, fast test suite in order to make this work. The other one, you have a module for context functions. Like I said, you're writing a CRUD app. You create stuff, you delete stuff, you update stuff, you list and get it. Like that's it. You don't change that. That's a canonical representation of something you need to do with your app. If you have something that's more complicated, write a dedicated command file for it. So if you need to like create stuff and send an email and save a file, then you run it through there. The reason for that is you have tests. Go back to the second rule. This is a canonical representation of your app. You need these tests to sit there and run, and you don't want to have to fool with them. They say it in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. It's a game of inches. Software development is a game of seconds. You have to save every second that you can to get your 40-hour MVP out of the door. The other one, Chris McCord is smarter than me. He wrote those generators. They work good. You don't need to fool with that. Just do it the way he put it in there. Like, don't try to be smart. Don't try to do subscription updates unless it's really necessary for your app. Don't try to do command it. Like, none of that stuff. Just use what they wrote. Don't pick a different database. Take the defaults. Take the defaults. Standardize, standardize, standardize. Like, don't do anything special. If you're not getting paid, don't write any code. So when people look at generators, they're like, oh, well, that's bad. It's just dumb boilerplate crap. And they'd be right. But you got to understand that in this paradigm of writing code, those constraints work to your advantage, because what you should be doing is taking a blunt instrument and using it to hammer on your potential customers' problems. And that's exactly what a generator is. It's a blunt instrument that does one thing. You just use it. You generate code and you use the generated code, and that's it. Because at the end of the day, let's think about the mental model here. Let's take out all the engineering decisions that we need to make about building this app. We're not going to think about the framework. We're going to use Liveview. Why? Because it doesn't require you to define an API. The file structure to get a Liveview app out of the door is incredibly simple, and it has all the options that are available in modern web apps. So use Liveview. You don't have to make a decision. Second, use PHX Gen Auth to protect it, and don't mess with it. Just use the generated code and don't change it. So you don't have to make a choice about framework. You don't have to make a choice about authorization. Next, customize your generators so that it produces the code that you need to generate your app. And don't change it. And don't think about it ever again. You generate the code, then you use it, and you ship your app. And you make these abstractions, like you abstract away your components, and then if you have functions that are running inside of your index or your form, and you need to write a new form, factor off all the handlers into a separate handler file, and then copy and paste the form. Once again, if you left everything the same, it's all under test, so you can't break it. The other one is use a component framework. Personally, I recommend pedal.build because it is literally specifically built for Liveview. They are Liveview components. They're so easy to write, you don't have to do anything. So let's think about it. What choices are we making? We're not making framework choices. We're not making authorization choices. We're not making choices about patterns, and we're not making choices about the app, how the app works. We have just taken out all of the hard engineering problems that block software engineers from getting software out the door. And we have one thing left, which is to focus on the customer's problem, which is exactly what you should be doing in an MVP. That's all I got. And Daisy is fantastic too.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. Yeah.
It's actually, in my opinion, in terms of like presentation and like versatility and selection of components, it beats pedal.build hands down.
Okay.
And-
Can you tell us more about it? Like what? Yeah. Can you compare them? Like for people
Sure.
who don't know? Yeah.
So
You can put them on screen if you want as well. If that's helpful.
sure, why not?
Raise it up.
Yeah. Come on. So pedal.build is basically a component framework that is targeted to LiveView. Like it's a LiveView library. And what it provides you with are a bunch of phone, like you can call. Do what? Yeah, it's a Tailwind. Well, okay, so this is part of my speech about component libraries. Do not use raw Tailwind, because then you have to build stuff. You don't want to build stuff. You want a Tailwind based component library, because then you have all the advantages of a bootstrap without the disadvantages of a bootstrap, because you can pull in these components, but then you can also use like Tailwind classes to customize anything that you need to. So it's beautiful. You get the best of both worlds. When you run into something that you have to do custom in your MVP, which you inevitably will, there's going to be one or two things in there, then you have the tools to do it. Pedal.build is great because it literally just exports functions. Like you just call these functions directly in your LiveView template and it produces nice looking stuff. And, you know, when I do my customized generators, I build a customized generator that calls up pedal.build components. And they're styled with Tailwind, and a lot of the interactivity is implemented with Alpine JS. So it like kind of helps keep some of the load off of your back end. Although I really don't care. The only thing that I care about is not having to make decisions or do work. Daisy UI is fantastic. It is a it is honestly a better CSS framework. It's got a lot more options, a lot more components, a lot more customizability. It's also got this it's got a bunch of themes that it ships with, so you can make your web page look like cyberpunk if you want to. It's fantastic. You could write the same thing. You just write your templates with this. Just a little more work.
Because this one does not ship with Tailwind component. Let's start with the Phoenix component.
Correct. You wind up doing you just style it, right? You just call the Tailwind class.
Okay. Cool. That was my question. Any other questions from anybody in the chat here? Most in the chat, if you want to, you can also speak up.
Yeah, I have a question. Less of I guess the Elixir side and more on the side of like, because you as a person working on your project with user docs, you sort of get into the sales position, and it's like crafting you into sort of a different person for like how you want to build apps that satisfy real business problems. And I was just curious, like the two ideas there. It was BandwidthHero, and the one before that was it
SME interviews.
SME, yeah. So did both those come from talking to the salesperson, or were they like I would almost call it like your understanding of the domain or of a business problem you could solve?
So SME interviews was my idea.
Straight for you,
Yeah, it was my idea. And it actually came, I did a LinkedIn poll. Like I had several ideas, because as I tried to market user docs, I spent a lot of time building a audience of technical writers on LinkedIn. And like I wrote a lot of copy and tried to get people interested in user docs. And then when I decided that user docs wasn't going to make me any money,
right,
I started asking about other ideas that I had for technical writers.
Community, though. Yeah.
And I took a poll, and that was the one that people were interested in. So that was the one that I built.
Like interviewing is hard in the technical writer space.
Yeah.
And then for the ERP one, which sounds like really fast to start looking that one around. Is that you?
No, that's actually my business partner joined us on the call today. His name is Ray Marquez, and he is a ERP consultant. So like
so that's how you leveled up the ERP, like through another person.
Yeah. And I don't know the space, and like he's actually the reason that I'm willing to do this. Yep. Is because I think that he can do it. He can market it. He can get consultants in there. And so like, even though, we don't have, like, my rule is, if you get financial commitments, I will build you a product. Yeah. But like, you don't have to be like hard and fast about it. I have something that's close enough to that where I feel like, okay, let's do this. Yeah. And it's not that much effort for us, right? We can spend 2-3 months on this.
Right.
And if we make some money, then we keep doing it. And if we don't,
And it's in sort of the same turnaround space as the interview one, like, there's no one walking you in the door, interviews happen everywhere, so ERP matching is already happening.
it's already happened. It's happening on LinkedIn. There's all these examples of how bad it happens too.
Right, having a really bad,
Yeah.
that's cool.
If you're trying to basically do rapid prototypes, then why would you use live view as opposed to just using templates? Because templates to me seem like a lot faster. You're generating them faster. The tests are more accurate. You're not worrying about UI and stuff like that. Is that another way to go, or is there a reason you choose to go to live view?
So I actually thought about this, and the fact is, there's not a really good technical reason to use live view over just standard Phoenix. You could do the exact same thing. The generators generate the same number of files. And part of the reason why I go with live view is because I have more experience with live view. And then the other part is, like, let's take SME interviews. Part of that application was that you wanted to be able to get online at the same time as your interviewee and ask them questions and have them provide answers. And so the reason why I say do live view is because the top of the funnel is wider, right? If you get into your traditional Phoenix app and then you're like, oh, I need some reactivity, or, oh, I need some real-time messaging. Well, now you got to rework. Now you got to make choices. And that's why I say from the very beginning, live view everything, because then you never have to make choices again. You never have to back up, and you never have to hit a barrier because there's something in there that the framework doesn't really do all that well. So, and I think the short answer is you can pick the one or the other, but if you pick live view, you don't have to make a decision. And I'm all for not making any decisions except about how to solve customer problems. So it's just about reducing the amount of brain space that you have to spend on engineering problems.
How much of this goes away when you find traction? And how does it go away?
So, you know, let's look at this. Like, what's the other really, like, you know, probably good and efficient way to build out MVPs? Like, the other thing that you could do is just like take the low code approach or the no code approach and use one of these tools to build out, you know, BandwidthHero, whatever. Probably take you a similar amount of time, maybe probably less than live view. But if you ever actually got traction and you needed to scale it, well, now you got to start over again and you got to do all this anyway. So I think the short answer is you don't really need to roll it back once it's in Phoenix and Liveview, because it's like a good application development
You
platform.
just like bake in your, you eject your generators or something and start ripping on those as actual code.
Well, I would just start writing the code on top of it.
Right.
Just take the generated code and start writing what you need. And like, because you eventually are going to come to a point where you really do have to start making decisions, and you have to start thinking about like performance or look and feel. But the fact that you're coming into it from generated code, it's not a barrier to entry for you to start optimizing on certain things or like customizing your front end. Like, to me, I think that the other advantage of the generated code approach is that when it's time to actually start writing code, you're coming from a pretty good starting point. You know what I mean? Like I said, we go back. Chris McCord is smarter than me. Like, he's put together some good design patterns and front end patterns for you to build an application on top of. So for my part, I feel really good about starting on that. And like, what are, like, you know, think about the things that would really mean that you need to go back to the beginning and rework them. Like, oh, well, we need this to be a client thing instead of a server side thing. Like, that's one. Oh, we need this to be CQRS. That's a thing. Like, oh, we need this to go in MongoDB. Like, all of those are things that might require you to go back and start over again. And even if you have to make some different engineering decisions and start over again at the very beginning, you lost 60 hours. Like, boo-hoo. You know what I mean? In the realm of software engineering, it's just not that big of a deal. So like, that's, you know, the advantage here is minimizing your investment into something that's probably not going to work out. Because that's the reality of building and selling your own software applications.